So we will now turn to our three panelists, and I'm delighted to introduce each of them in turn. Deepika Rao is the Executive Director at Cividep India, a Bangalore-based organisation working for workers' rights and corporate accountability. Bulent Alkanli is the Managing Director of Meta Sourcing, a sourcing office based in Istanbul working with European and American brands, and he is an elected board member of the Turkish Clothing Manufacturers Association from 2014 to 2021. Michael Sadowski is a research consultant to the World Resources Institute and an independent advisor to a variety of global brands and organizations on issues including climate change and the circular economy. Michael was the co-author of the report, Roadmap to Net Zero, Delivering Science-Based Targets in the Apparel Sector, published in November 2021, from which we have drawn the data for our metric. So let's turn first to Deepika. Deepika, to what extent do the figures we have just shared reflect the industry we want?
Thanks, Olivia. The data gives us a very good picture of the industry we have, and that we are a long way off the industry we want, despite decades of work that have gone into the question of wages. It speaks volumes. We've always known that wages in the industry are abysmally low, but this data clearly shows how minimum wages in every production country are significantly lower than even the most conservative living wage estimates. I must emphasize here that living wage estimates are calculated to account for a worker's family being able to meet the most basic living needs. Some of these estimates are higher or lower based on their varying methodology. There can be a whole separate debate on the appropriate methodology, but for the industry as a whole to fall so far behind even the most conservative estimates in all their production countries says a lot about the state of it. And minimum wages are what the workers get. Clean Clothes Campaign and its partners have done a lot of work on researching and advocating for living wages. Their research shows that even though some retailers and brands recognize in principle the right to a living wage in their voluntary codes and initiatives, in practice, they often just monitor their suppliers' compliance with statutory minimum wage in the country of operation. Governments in producing regions keep minimum wages as low as possible so that they are able to mitigate the risk of flight by brands to other production countries. The threat of relocation is a major obstacle to bargaining higher wages and also a huge hurdle in organizing workers. If I were to take the example of my own home state of Karnataka, where a wage struggle is ongoing, almost 400,000 workers did not receive the legal minimum wage for 2 years because the factories resisted a revision in wages during the pandemic. This is clearly the result of a strong downward push by brands on prices at which they source, forcing factory owners to cut production costs to such extreme levels. The case has been languishing for 2 years between courts, the government, and the business associations, with workers and their families bearing the brunt. Minimum wages are politically negotiated benchmarks where costs of living play a minor role, if at all, and these wages fall below poverty line for many production countries. The garments and textile industry is a buyer-driven one, as brands are largely responsible for how value is distributed across the value chain. So these numbers are a reflection of how well the brands have fared in their social responsibilities more than any other actor in the garment value chain.
Thank you, Deepika. And Bulent, now speaking from your perspective, to what extent do you feel as though the better buying results reflect the industry we want?
Thanks, Olivia, for brief information about the whole index. First of all, I would say that I'm quite happy to see the number of suppliers who have attended in that short period of time and completed the survey. It gives us that suppliers are in need of their voices to be heard. And when they find the right platform, then they go for it. So for me, the results are positive, pleasantly surprising as well. And I believe that it's a good representation of the industry. We just need to focus on maybe certain areas and looking at the metrics. I would say the main concern is on the communication area, I would say, between the buyer and the supplier. We can say that, of course, there is daily communication between the two parties, but real communication where everyone listens to each other. From what I can see is that we can say that half of the glass is full, but half of the glass is empty, and that empty part is actually causing inconsistencies in the margin that is being distributed within the supply chain as well. If the buyer gets closer to the supplier and listens during the product development process and listens to them in terms of innovation, gives kind of an information in terms of the projections that they have for that particular supplier, then I think that the capacity of the supplier can be utilized much better, which will enable the factory to have an overall better margin for the total supply chain. So I think the first focus needs to be basically the communication, the current unsatisfactory communication.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Bulent. That's very interesting. And Michael, you were part of the team that pulled together all the data for the recent report. Do you feel as though the figures reflect the industry we want, or how do you feel about them?
Yeah, so Olivia, thank you for having me. I would just start by saying I think it's important that you've selected greenhouse gases as the single environmental indicator. I think climate change is the most pressing environmental issue we face, and I think it's connected to other impact areas, whether it's environmental or social. So I think that's really important. I think it's also important to note that reducing emissions by roughly half by 2030 and to net zero by 2050 is really a global goal. Every industry has to decarbonize at that rate. We're above 1 degree Celsius increase, so we're not really doing great as a planet to reduce emissions. And so we can talk about the apparel sector here. I think there are a number of studies over the past 5 years which have aimed to put a number to the emissions of the sector. We decided in the roadmap to use Higg index data, as well as textile exchange data, because we feel like those were the best data sets that we have. It's a really good first estimate. It's a good baseline to improve upon going forward. So we're excited to see that the work will be refreshed year after year to get the data better, and also just gives the sector a good benchmark to say how well are we doing as more and more companies sign up for science-based targets. So it's a good first start. We know what to do, and we'll talk more later about the steps needed to reduce emissions.
Great, thanks, Michael. Bulent, I'm interested to know how you think the data that we're gathering from Better Buying could be useful in helping us move, more quickly towards an industry we want, or if you think there are limitations to that data or things that we might need to think about as we go forward and reach out to suppliers and kind of build that data set.
Well, I think starting with the second question about the limitations, I think there are no limitations, there are opportunities in that report. There are many aspects of the report that needs to be analyzed by the buyers and by the suppliers as well. But what I think is that this report is going to give us a good guideline on the areas to focus, the direction that we need to take altogether. The advantage of this is actually it's a collective opinion and a collective voice of many suppliers across different countries in our industry, and it is important that this information that is provided is taken in a structured way, so that when people are looking at the report, we know that everyone has answered the same questions, but in a different way. And the only limitation I would say is that this kind of speaking up needs to be on a regular basis. So one supplier, when they have done and completed the survey and have made their comments, I believe that their should be a continuity of that, and it needs to be regularly updated because things are changing, factories are changing, brands are changing. And in order for us to see the improvement, we would like to get the opinion of the suppliers in a regular way, in a regular base.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean that's certainly one of the things we're hoping to establish with the industry we want and with our partnership with the Better Buying Institute, because the survey will be rolled out every year for the next 3 years. There'll be 3 more surveys at least. So each year suppliers will have the opportunity to contribute to that survey, and each year see those results reflected back in this session and other sessions throughout the course of the year. So we're really looking forward to that and hope it's of value to the sector. Michael, same question to you really. How might these metrics be helpful in our efforts as we try to create the industry we want, and what might their limitations be?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, over the past 5 years, a number of studies have been put out that estimate the apparel sector emissions, and frankly, there's a pretty wide range of numbers, and also some fairly grandiose claims made about the impact of the apparel sector. You might have heard, apparel is 8% or 10% of global emissions. It's greater than aviation. It's the 4th largest in certain countries. I would generally take all of those claims with very large grains of salt. The reason why we use the Higg Index and textile exchange data is because we wanted to use widely used data sets. A large portion of the apparel sector is using the Higg to compute their impacts. And we wanted to start using that and make it better over time. So we feel like every year the Material Sustainability Index and other pieces of the Higg will only get better as more and more companies use this information. We were very clear in the report there are limitations to those data sets, and yet we feel like if we agree as an industry to use this underlying data and make it better over time, the estimate that we have will only get better. And so our goal in putting out this report, or one of the goals, was to say, let's align on the underlying data and go forward. Let's stop using different data sets as an industry and go from there.
Yeah, I mean, that shares our view that consistency is key, regularity is key, applying the same methodology year after year and really getting a sense of what's happening, rather than these kind of disparate reports and indicators and measurements that we get so often, which are hugely valuable in themselves. But of course, the consistency should really help us, I hope. And Deepika, I'd love to hear your views on how the wages metric might help us to achieve the industry we want, and what the potential limitations of that metric and these metrics might also be.
Yeah, first of all, wage is a very important indicator of the status of social compliance and responsibility within the fashion garment industry. It indirectly signals the status of so many other indicators: status of gender-based violence, child and adolescent labor, forced labor, freedom of association, and informality in the sector. The metrics give a very clear picture of where the industry stands on wages. That is, on an average, it pays less than half of what is required for basic necessities. So then the claims by the industry associations and initiatives that the industry is a vehicle for women empowerment and employment fall flat. These numbers clearly show that the industry, in fact, uses the vulnerability of women workers to push down production costs and shore up profits. The metrics are stating something that has been obvious to labor researchers and activists. There have been numerous reports on the subject. The wage metric by the industry we want, in my eyes, is an effort to consolidate and present these findings in a way that the communication is not crowded. There is a focus on one important metric where the industry must show progress. It is, after all, a highly profitable industry. Why are its workers receiving poverty wages? Why are the minimum wages in these countries so low? And what is the role that the brands are playing in keeping these low? What are the steps that the brands are taking to raise the bar in their countries of influence? The brands and retailers would be forced to answer these questions. And intense mobilization offline and online needs to happen around these questions. An important aspect of this initiative is also that these important metrics are tracked year on year. So we are actually able to hold the industry accountable for their lack of progress over time, rather than having one-off reports which brands are easily able to dismiss or tide over. Here we have one consolidated approach that gives us a clear overview of several years, and that is very valuable to the sector. As for the limitations, the initiative sets out with a very focused and limited mandate of indicating the status of the industry on a key indicator like wages on an annual basis. I think it achieves that promise, and along with extending support to initiatives which are seeking to raise national and industry level wages, it is addressing a very key issue, and I appreciate the focus and yet the scope of things that can be achieved under this umbrella.
Thanks, Deepika. Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that the wages metric can also be a metric for other issues in some ways. It's a kind of lead metric. As some of you may know, whether you've participated or not, we did run a number of consultations and we did identify many areas that people wanted to focus on. Overwhelmingly, these three issues came up as the kind of bellwethers for the industry as a whole. And I believe that if all of these indicators, all three of them, were reflecting very positively on the industry, we would feel more confident about some of the other issues, about social protection, about access to remedy, about other issues to do with waste. So we're hoping to really focus on the three as indicators for the industry as a whole. Yeah, so anyway, finally, just a quick question to all of you. Let's start with Michael. Michael, what change do you think we need to see the industry we want?
So previously, I mentioned the uncertainty around the data. So we obviously need to continue to improve the data. But even with that, we generally know what the sector needs to do to decarbonize along that 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. And we outline, 6 things in the roadmap to net zero. There are things like increasing energy efficiency, which for many manufacturers can be done and can save money. Things like accelerating the development of new materials, using more sustainable materials that we have access to today. We know coal in manufacturing is a big driver of emissions, and it's frankly a very quote unquote good fuel source because it's plentiful, it's cheap, it has high heat value. So, other things like renewable energy. So we know the things that we have to do. We also in the roadmap talk about circular business models, things like rental and repair. We know that those things are generating a lot of enthusiasm in certain markets. They're very small, and there are some issues that we have to figure out. But we need all of these things and more. But I think fundamentally, we won't get around the fact that it's going to require investment in these things. Brands are setting these targets. I think they're taking these targets and then passing them back in the supply chain and saying, we need to deliver on a science-based target. Hey, manufacturers, go do this. Manufacturers then say, well, will you pay us more? Will you co-invest? Will you commit to us for more than 6 months, 12 months? We frankly have to change buying practices and the nature of the relationship between brands and manufacturers, because I think there's no way of getting around this like with other sectors. It's going to take investment to decarbonize. So thankfully, we have nearly 200 companies that have committed to science-based targets. So there's tremendous momentum. I think we're now at the point where we need to actually align on, how do we co-invest to make this possible?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Michael. Really interesting. And thank you again for highlighting the importance of the purchasing practices and the shared responsibility that we need to see as we move forward as an industry to realize some of these changes. Deepika, to you, what change do you think we would need to see if we would like to create the industry we want?
Yeah, brands must make their policy on wages clear. Do they acknowledge these numbers? What are time-bound steps that they're taking to improve the situation in their own production locations? Are they supporting or blocking an increase in national minimum wages by negotiating production costs? Are they supporting or blocking or staying out of industry-wide initiatives on raising wages? Fashion brands and retailers should set public, concrete and measurable steps for the entire supply chain to ensure garment workers are paid a living wage within a reasonable time frame. And it is important for all stakeholders to directly address the power asymmetry, which is the root cause behind these conditions. Brands have a disproportionate amount of power to distribute value across the supply chain and set terms for doing business. They have used this power to set up suppliers against supplier and country against country in a race to the bottom. As long as the power asymmetry remains, the situation will not change. And finally, voluntary and private regulation has its limits. The global fast fashion business model needs a policy that combats relocation competition between countries around wages. It also needs a mandatory human rights due diligence policy, which puts the onus of human rights violations due to low wages of workers on the brands.
Thank you, Deepika. No shortage of things that need to be done. Hopefully we can help, as the industry we want, convene the necessary actors to help encourage and support that progress, because there is a lot that we need to address. Bulent, finally, the final word. What change would you like to see if we're to realize the industry we want?
First of all, I would say this dashboard should not be considered as a snapshot of the current status only, and there has to be, besides the survey being repeated, there has to be other actions that needs to be taken in between. It's kind of a call to action, and first of all, the largest participation on the survey is definitely necessary, that we have a better average result. Buyers needs to be called to action on the points. And one area that I find interesting, but not surprising, is that the ETI and fair wear scores are higher than the industry averages. It is actually quite an important point that needs to be considered. So this report is not only reflecting the result on the buyer end, but also it's showing a path for foundations and organizations like ETI and Fairware, where they are aware of best practices within their brands that needs to be made visible for other brands to follow. So there is, I believe, a lot to do together with the brands, with the foundations and organizations, and I'm grateful about to the Industry We Want initiative that has taken the lead in the industry when it's really needed the most. Thanks for the work to everyone in the Industry We Want.
Thank you, Bulent. That's very nice. And you're right to sort of refer to the disclosure of the ETI and the Fair Wear scores, because certainly within the industry we want, we would love to encourage more transparency on purchasing practices, more disclosure, more sort of talking about those issues and being very honest about where we are and where we need to go. So I think it's really encouraging that we have that data set, and we're looking forward to seeing how it develops over the next few years. Okay, well, thank you so much, Deepika, Bulent, Michael. It's been a real pleasure. And yeah, we're looking forward to continuing. Thank you very much for joining us today.